So I was going to start this discussion with looking at chord analysis and melody and tonality and whatever. But then I was doing some research for the video. I began to read about some of the game's influence from Spanish folk tradition and Catholicism. Like, okay, there's the historical and cultural and religious iconography, and the use of Spanish in a lot of the names, locations, characters, and items is obvious enough. But did you know that much of the game's lexicon is specifically of a dialect of Spanish from the Andalusian region of Spain? Or that the music is influenced by flamenco, a style of music and dance very important to the people of Andalusia? This makes a lot of sense because, well, a lot of the game's developers are from this region and took inspiration from it. Man, I went on a deep internet dive with this one, and at the end of it, I feel like I know less about flamenco than I did going in. Like, what the heck? There are over 50 different styles of flamenco? Now, I'm not going to dissect the soundtrack from the perspective of Andalusian flamenco, but what I can say is that it's clear the soundtrack to Blasphemous draws on influence from traditional Andalusian music, something you'll probably pick up on yourself during this soundtrack review. Now, without further ado, let's dive into some analysis. So let's start off by taking a look at a piece we hear early on in the game, and that sets the tone for much of the soundtrack. Que las campañas me doblen. Okay, for the sake of me and my 12 viewers, I'm going to use the English names of the locations for these pieces. Now, look, I have a good excuse for not knowing Spanish. I spent the first 18 years of my life in Miami, Florida. Wait, what am I saying? That's not an excuse. That's a missed opportunity. Anyway, this is the piece which plays in the area called the Wasteland of Buried Churches. Immediately we're hit by that wasteland-ish vibe, with the heavy reverb and echo, groaning synths that phase in and out like the wind, and the continual strum of this lightly amped guitar. Reducing the music to a bare-bones tonal structure, we see that the piece is really not that complex. These measures slowly alternate between the first and second diminished seventh, which creates this feeling that is both eerie and incredibly forlorn. This is accentuated by the upbeat triplet rhythm of the strummed guitar. Now this progression goes on for quite a while, a whole 16 measures if we're using a 6/4 time signature, and then we shift towards this slight variation here. Oh, damn, okay, we're back at those two chords. I thought it was going to go somewhere different. Well, maybe this part later in the melody will take us into a new key or maybe a different harmony. Or not. Jeez, this piece is depressing. The composer continues to iterate on these same paired chords. All the while we get some hints of transitions and possible transformations, but it always pulls back at the last minute. Especially here when we're at the peak of this 7/7 chord, and the musical tension is at its highest. We merely ease back into the tonic without fanfare or any feeling of satisfaction. Note how the root and the bass is intentionally left out, a choice that adds to that feeling of listlessness, this lack of resolution. Like our character on his search for salvation and repentance, the music seems to wander without a clear path forward. A lot of the techniques and stylistic choices present here are echoed throughout pieces in the game. To see what I mean, take a listen to a few of these other pieces. I try to pick out the same kind of rhythmic and harmonic patterns you identified for the Wasteland. So here's the music for the location called Mercy Dreams. The Convent of Our Lady of the Charred Visage. arch-cathedral rooftops. And the wall of holy prohibitions. Now, I don't quite know how to feel about this. On one hand, this style is enjoyable, emotional, and effective at establishing the game's despondent and muted tone. But the consequence of relying heavily on this same theming is that it really makes a good chunk of the music a little sluggish, a little too simple. Not boring or bad, but for example, there were times I was going back through the soundtrack in preparation for this video and I was like, yeah, I remember that area. The Wall of Holy Prohibitions had some sick music. And then I would rewatch gameplay footage and be like, wait, what? That song's from a completely different area. I found myself confusing some of the pieces for the respective areas, which is not what you want in a Metroidvania style game like this. And now this doesn't always happen, and those times where it didn't was when the variation in style was handled well, like how it is in the Convent of Our Lady. Here we have a different key signature, new progressions, and varied instrumentation, which distinguish it from the Wasteland very well. But on the other side, we have the Wall of Holy Prohibitions, whose progressions, key signature, and rhythmic patterns are all nearly identical to the Wasteland. As a result, these pieces kind of blend together in my head, and I often end up forgetting about one or the other. What's more is that these feelings of listlessness and despondency which permeate much of the soundtrack definitely weigh on the listener over time. I found myself preferring the more unique sounds of places like Graveyard of the Peaks, whose isolated piano gives both a creepy and desolate vibe that's unique to the entire soundtrack. Or the Desecrated Cistern, whose major key signature helps keep things fresh and interesting. Now let's talk about the music for the bosses. Like the areas, each gets its own unique piece, which is really a nice touch. The pieces for the bosses are a little more experimental, employing different instruments like electric guitar and heavy percussion, and often applying more varied rhythmic patterns. I take the theme for Ten Piedad, which is simple and repetitive, but has this compelling harmony and unique layering of electric guitar and synth. This intense and intimidating piece does well to characterize the twisted nature of this boss and creates a lot of tension, which is what you want in a good boss track. But there's some bad news here. A number of boss tracks have that same problem that the area tracks have, which is that they rely too heavily on these slower, more simple harmonies and don't change things up enough. Now the track for Ten Piedad employs this technique well, using it to create that imposing, threatening sound you mentioned. But now let's take a look at the music for Tres Angustias. Now the design of this boss in the battle arena is really memorable. The battle is frantic, it combines platforming and combat well, and it has a few good surprises. But the music... it's just kind of meandering. Like, it's not unfitting or bad. Relying on this simplistic progression for most of the piece is a fair choice. It emphasizes this sense of constant ascending and lends to the very region itself, whose name comes from the moans that rise from its dark depths. In that sense, this piece is fantastic. But this is a boss battle. I'm looking for a little more here, a little more unpredictability, more zest. I'm not really intimidated by this music compared to Ten Piedad. This isn't necessarily a problem with the piece by itself so much, but with the soundtrack as a whole. When you have so many boss battles, all with their own themes and identities, it's a challenge to make them all unique and compelling. I think a better choice would have been to reuse some of the more memorable boss tracks, like Ten Piedad and Alquires. Like, those are powerful, compelling pieces that I want to listen to multiple times. Why do I only get to hear them once? Though I do think that certain themes should stay special for their own boss. The big example of this is the music for Circe, Returned by the Flames. Man, this piece is a banger. The interesting harmonies, that constant strumming in the affected guitar, the great syncopation in that woody percussion. This piece is intense and relentless and mirrors the boss's frantic and varied movements perfectly. It's not just the claustrophobic arena and hot-footed dodging that makes this one of the best bosses in the game. That catchy music is just as important. It makes this battle so memorable, despite it coming out of nowhere. Despite its shortcomings in terms of musical variety, the soundtrack to Blasphemous does do a good job at diversifying and elaborating on the visual and narrative tones of the story. I mean, the plot is that you are slaughtering monsters while traveling through a ravaged world on a quest for penitence, and yet here we are listening to gentle arpeggios on a Spanish guitar. The music definitely dials things back and emphasizes the more melancholy, more quietly despondent sides to this world. There are definitely some standout pieces like the tracks for Circe and the Wasteland of the Buried Churches, and there are some good choices made when it comes to the game music design, like excluding a track for the area called Hondo. Instead, we have just these amplified echoes of normal sounds which emphasize the vastness and emptiness of this space. But taken as a whole, the entire soundtrack can be a little stale. When I listen back through it, I find myself skipping a lot more of the plain or unmemorable pieces for the bangers, you know what I mean? But on the other hand, there's no doubt that the flamenco influence makes this soundtrack feel incredibly unique. Like, I would love to see more of this aesthetic of music in video games. So many Souls-like games draw inspiration for their soundtracks exclusively from their Dark Souls and Bloodborne predecessors. Even Hollow Knight, which has a fantastic soundtrack, is a little guilty of this to an extent, I feel. It's great to see the game's developers and composer, Carlos Viola, opt for a more meaningful and novel style in this case. Well, if you need me, I'll be serving my own penance by playing the DLC that just came out. Oh, wish me luck. It's gonna take a miracle to beat that boss rush. Okay, I'll leave now.
It made roots grow and twist over his arms and legs, but not a cry nor a complaint came out from his mouth. Every inhabitant of this land bore witness to it, and all of them prayed before the besought eternal joy of that youngster.